Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Okay, I've saved like the best for last here. Ami Fields-Meyer is a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. What that really means, I'm sure he won't tell you this, is that he's held really important jobs in government and will again when the administration changes. That's what that means at the Kennedy School.
I appreciate your vote of confidence, Edwin. That's nice.
Well, his work there is like our work on this show. It is about our democracy, how to protect it and how to renew it. And he recently co-authored with Julia Angwin this fabulous book called On Courage, How to Be a Dissident in an Age of Fear. And it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you and appreciate all of your good work.
Well, let's start with our good work. You're in the democracy business. I'm interested to know what you think that means.
To be working on democracy?
To be in this democracy business right now. What does it mean?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think, one thing that's been interesting, frustrating, fascinating is that I think that the salience of the word democracy has diminished over time. I think that a lot of the nonprofits and foundations that work on this stuff would tell you that from a sort of marketing perspective, trying to get resources and attention and energy attracted to their work, that there was a massive effort around quote unquote shoring up our democracy the last time we had this guy in office, and it didn't really work. And so, there's a question about what it means to be doing this work. I also think that for a younger generation of people who do feel very invested in their future, the word democracy itself may have actually lost some salience, in part because it may not have been working for them all that well to begin with. If you can't afford a house, if you can't find a job, if you can't sort of be basically stable, then the sort of abstract principles of representative democracy, of having a constitutional republic, are just abstract principles. And so a lot of, I think, our work right now, those of us in the quote unquote democracy business, is first, I think, just to deliver for people and to make sure that people can live a good, dignified life. And that's the proof point I think people will need. We talk a lot about in this book, a lot of the book is just about people trying to seize on their values, and less about the sort of abstract notion of what a democracy might mean. But I think it's a really good question.
Well, let's turn to the book. There's a lot of, first off, there are a lot of great stories. They're just inspiring, great stories. Do you have one that we don't have that much time. Do you have one that you love telling?
There's a story that I love telling about I guess maybe I'll just say one very quickly, which is we start the book on the idea of a moral collision. And this is sort of the basis of the book. A moral collision is this idea that people who become dissidents in some form or another, by which we really mean people who take a risk to defend their values in the context of, political repression, generally do so after they realize that something that they care about is clashing with what's going on in the world. And so we open the book on a story that I think is probably relatable to those of us who care about democracy, which is the story of a civil rights lawyer who was working in this Trump administration's Housing and Urban Development office. He was a civil servant, and he realized very early on in this administration that the people he was now working for were not going to enforce civil rights law. They weren't going to enforce the Fair Housing Act. And as a result, there were people all over the United States who were at risk of housing discrimination, eviction, and otherwise. And so he had this moment. And I think this is the kind of moment that many of us feel. It's not always as dramatic, between keeping his head down and keeping his job, or blowing the whistle and speaking out, both speaking out to Congress and also speaking out on the radio and on television to just alert the people who could do something about this, that the US government was no longer protecting people from housing discrimination, and that was putting lots of people at risk. And so he did it. And when you ask him, and this is the reason I would offer this as the example, Edwin, is because it's paradigmatic in our book. When you ask him, why did you do that? Why did you put your job at risk, the thing that you had trained for? Why did you put your livelihood at risk? in order to for an abstract principle, as we're just sort of describing. And he says, I didn't do something that I felt was so courageous. I am a civil rights lawyer. That's the thing that I do. That's what I was put here for. That's what I've pursued. I
Yep.
was just doing what I do. I was just being who I am. And so I think a lot of our book is how do you preserve the values that are close to you? How do you continue to be who you are when the world is casting you as something like a dissident?
That story resonated with me because I worked at HUD in the Clinton
Right,
administration.
right.
So it caught me right away.
Yeah,
And your book is organized, as you say, it starts with this personal, like, okay, something has happened, and
yeah.
I have a dilemma, I have a challenge, I have a decision. It's a very American kind of way of organizing. It's sort of starts personal. It's kind of self-help, but
Yeah.
you expand to to how you go from that moment to building a community that keeps you safe, a community that makes you effective, and you did this by looking all over the world at where people have done this successfully.
Over the course of under a year, my co-author Julia Angwin and I spoke to over 100 people, about 120 people, dissidents, opposition leaders, activists, people who have faced down some kind of oppression all over the world, from the United States to Venezuela to Russia to Nicaragua to Hungary to Hong Kong and beyond. And what happens when you do that kind of unscientific but sort of scientific review is that you start to notice trends. And so the reason we structure the book this way is because this is what we found. We found that people would generally, it is very, you're right, Edwin, it is very American to start with the individual and not necessarily with the collective, but a slightly less cynical finding was that people who had the moment like the one I just described, we also profile toward the beginning of the book a Venezuelan woman in the outskirts of working class Caracas, who had
Yep.
been part of the Maduro Chavez political apparatus. She had been the beneficiary of lots of political patronage, and they had helped her with her job and her career. And she was the first person on the food line. At some point, when there was an economic crisis, she realized that she had been duped and she had been lied to, and that she wasn't able to feed her children anymore. And so she also had this moral collision moment. So she, like the guy at HUD and like people all over the world, very quickly found other people who shared those values and shared those concerns. And we call that
Mhm.
in the book, it's a Jewish concept. We call it a minyan, making a minyan, right? You find in Judaism, there's an idea of you can only do certain prayers, you can only grieve, you can only be called to the Torah, very important things, holy things. You can only do that with 10 other people. And the idea is that because to share emotionality, to share important experience, you have to, there is something unlocked by being around other people. So this is something we find over and over again. I'll give one example of this from history, which is that the Soviet dissident movement, who a lot of people think about when they hear the word dissident, the Sakharovs of the world, I should say not of the world, but of the Soviet Union. That movement never grew to be more than about 1,000 people at any given time, and aided, with the aid of geopolitical forces, we're really able, in these pods of a few people all over the place, we're able to help bring down an empire, a very repressive empire. And what we find when we read about and we talk to former Soviet dissidents is that they say gathering with people regularly did two things. One, it was pragmatic. It allowed you to plan. For them, it was like, how are we going to smuggle Samistat out of here? How are we going to get our writings out to the rest of the world to undermine the regime? But it was also something spiritual, which is to say it was emboldening, right? Authoritarianism, as we found in this country, is the government says, you thought you saw Alex Preddy shot in the street? No, you didn't. You thought you saw Renee Good shot in the street? Think again. And so when that's happening, when you're just hearing lies and lies and lies, the other piece of gathering with other people in these political homes that we're talking about, that we think Americans should organize in more, is that both it allows you to plan pragmatically, but also to have the sort of spiritual boon of being emboldened by people who see what you see, who believe what you believe, and then can push you to go even further in your activism.
I love that. I mean, and the examples, I mean, there's so many, and there's so many good ideas, like accompanying somebody,
Mm.
just that make all the difference and make us feel like we're safe. And then, when accompanying somebody turns into bringing a blanket, turns into something bigger, like you end up being tell the story that you told the other day about the fellow who was a volunteer and then ended up having a huge role in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I was glad that you came. So we had this great event in Chicago a couple weeks ago at the Onion headquarters, which is, and I should just shout, like, I know we're talking to Chicago and Midwestern folks. The Onion has become this sort of bastion of democracy, I think, and it's a pretty amazing place and group of people. So I'll tell about. So this is a guy named Nathan Law. Nathan Law is now about 32 years old, but when he got involved, 32, 33, something like that. But he was a student, a first-year student at a university in Hong Kong when at the beginning of what was called the Umbrella Revolution. Obviously, Hong Kong has been as an island city, has been in a mortal fight with China for many years over its sovereignty and independence. And there, as often is the case, the most recent iteration of a movement to push back and against China, the Chinese government, began with students, and it began on university campuses where a lot of this stuff incubates. So Nathan describes himself as a very risk-averse person. He had dreams, actually, of traveling the world and of learning a language. He said that he also really wanted to learn how to play guitar. And as a result of all of that, he just was a risk-averse guy. He didn't see himself getting involved, but he had run for student government just to be kind of, as an activity. And he said he went to the first meeting of the organizing around the protests for what would become the Umbrella Revolution, these massive wave of protests against for Hong Kong sovereignty. And he describes that there were they gave volunteers three options for how they wanted to be involved in the protest. You could either be in the front row of the protest and you were essentially risking arrest. You could be in sort of a little bit further back, but helping to make up the mass of people to show the cameras and others that there were a lot of people there. Slightly less risky. Or the third option was you could just bring the water bottles. Bring water bottles and hand them out to your fellow students so they had something to drink and weren't dehydrated. And he describes to us, and we write about this in the book, almost instinctually, he checked the last one, water bottles, no risk at all. Nathan Law, as a result of going to bring the water bottles and witnessing both the camaraderie of what was happening to the people who were on the front lines, but also the brutality that people were being beaten and pepper sprayed on the front lines, he saw so much and he felt so connected to this community that one thing led to another, and he was very quickly one of the faces of the movement. He was ultimately nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by a bipartisan group of U.S. senators, and became one of the China's most wanted figures, and had to flee and now lives in London in exile. But it's a perfect example of something that we see over and over again, which is that you don't have to start at the front. And you don't, the truth is, Edwin, you don't even have to end up at the front. But there are these small asks. Maybe I'll end with this for now, which is just to say, I've worked on political campaigns, as I know you have, intimately. And one thing that you would think that the way to get somebody really involved in your campaign is to do something for them, is to prove to them that you can do something for them. But the truth is, as you know well, as a long-term political person, is that actually the best thing to do is to ask them to do something for you, to ask them to knock on a door, to ask them to make a phone call, or even to give some money. And what they do, when that happens, people end up feeling invested in the story and a character in the story and invested in the outcome. And so we see that over and over again all over the world, from the United States to Hong Kong to Chicago and beyond.
Your book does not, however, make light of the dangers that these dissidents have felt. You have a whole section on threats and violence. But in the end, and I mean way in the end, because it's in the acknowledgments section at the end, you quote like an 18th century Ukrainian rabbi who says, know that a person needs to cross a very, very narrow bridge. And the essence is not to give in to fear at all. Square that. I mean, are you really telling people go face the bullets? Or are you saying something like, it's okay to be afraid, but don't give in to it?
What we're saying, actually, I think our book takes very, very seriously the threats that people feel.
I think so too.
I think actually that, I think that if we had wanted to write a book if we had written a book about like the Navalny's of the world, not to minimize the extraordinary courage of these people, but the Navalny's or the Mandelas or the Gandhis or Malala, these people who
Sure.
are sort of preternaturally courageous, I think that would have been an interesting book, but I'm not sure how it would have been an especially helpful book for regular people. Like, I'm a regular guy. I'm not like those people. And most of us are like that also. And so we wanted to write a book that took really seriously the reasons that people don't take political risks, that people don't stand up for their values,
and then end up doing it.
And then do it anyway. Like, what is it about the people who do end up doing it that makes them do it? And I think what we find is that it is rarely, as though I just use this word, it's rarely preternatural. It's rarely magic. What it is actually that saying that you just described, which is that it's acknowledging that this is scary and then finding ways to do it anyway. And the section that you're describing, I would say, which is called on threats and violence or something, it's the sort of don't do stupid stuff chapter, is saying there. I think that we assume that great political dissidents are people who take enormous risk and sort of just deal with whatever. If they kill me, they kill me. If they jail me, they jail me. And that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is you should minimize the risks. There are things that you can do. We should be aiming for no unforced errors. And there are, the theory that we lay out, that somebody describes to us as of staying safe under political repression, is what we call a Swiss cheese theory, which is like no one thing. You could use the right apps, or you can use or you can have the right security consultants, or you can have an alarm system, or you can use the right code words, or whatever it is. No one of those things is necessarily going to keep you safe in a world of both digital surveillance and physical threat. But if you stack those defenses, then you can really minimize the threats. And what we're arguing for is not a world where there are no threats in your political work, but a world where there are just fewer, to the point where you can just do your job. You can just do the thing that you want to do, and you can be a little bit less distracted and concerned and anxious and worried that something's going to get you because you've done the investing that needs to happen in your personal security. So we don't poo-poo that stuff. We take it really seriously, and we try to give folks the resources in their regular person lives to do something about it.
Yeah. So you studied these movements around the world. I think there's something different here, because American history is a little different. I mean, there was no experience of political freedom in Russia, not ever.
Right.
Barely any in Hong Kong, and you mentioned earlier, like the propaganda that we're getting all the time from the right wing at the very beginning. I think it is not meant to make you believe the president's not a crook. Americans think he's a crook. It's not meant to make you believe that we're winning a war in Iran, that Americans think we're losing. It's not meant to make you think prices are going down when they're going up. It's meant to make you forget yourself, forget who we are, forget the history of freedom in America and the advocacy, the agency that we all have. Because if we're either scared, or we're busy being outraged, or we're told to hate each other, the Gaza balloon goes up every 4 minutes, and then the trans balloon goes up every other minute. It's all meant to make people walk away from each other and be afraid. If we remember our history, if we remember ourselves, if we ignore the sign outside the Smithsonian that says the story of overcoming obstacles is a lie, if we ignore that sign when we go in and actually learn that, like Black Americans overcame like unbelievable, horrible stuff and taught us all what the Declaration means, we have a better chance of getting through this.
Authoritarianism is about stealing your money and your rights. And
I think your memory too.
Well, and I think that part of what makes it's definitely about claiming memory. Jason Stanley's book on fascism and the fight over memory. I can't remember exactly the name of the book. Fantastic book on this. Yep. And I would even just say, as an aside, there was a reason why I think it was actually on July 4th, this White House's Domestic Policy Council put out a report on July 4th, on the 250th anniversary, on the U.S. History Museum, on the Smithsonian U.S. History, National U.S. History Museum, about how they're so woke and how they're trying to claim history, and they're telling all these stories, and they're elevating race and talking about race as divisive. And this is very there's extraordinary parallels with other authoritarian regimes in that regard. But the reason I just said, so of course you're right, but the reason I bring up those other two is because the most efficient way to get you to cede your freedom is to point to the other people in society who the government says are taking those freedoms for you. Don't blame us, it's the trans people. Don't blame us, it's the students. Don't blame us, it's the DEI hires or whoever it is. And so as a result, I think our thesis in this book is that fighting authoritarianism is basically, if I were to do it on one foot, it's expanding your definition of who you mean by we. At precisely the moment when the government is asking you or compelling you to shrink your definition of who we mean by we.
Very smart.
And I would just say, this is not a perfect country. We've had deep racial traumas and original sin of slavery, which we've never addressed. And there's a reason why these things keep flaring up. These themes keep flaring up. But I do think that we have moments and movements in American history where we have a little bit at a time done that work of expanding who we mean by we. We've done that certainly over time, gradually and way too slowly, expanding who has the right to vote, who can own property, and in a more spiritual sense, like who is. I think about the 90s when I was very young, but there was a lot. The 90s was all about multiculturalism and hyphenates, right? And I think there's always a backlash, as we're seeing right now. Carol Anderson's book. Carol Anderson is an amazing scholar of history at Emory, who's my professor at Emory, actually.
Oh, fabulous.
And she has an amazing book called White Rage, which sort of chronicles what I'm talking about here, all these backlashes.
It's a great book.
It's a great book. And on the other side of this, there is a constant drumbeat of people who are doing the work of trying to do that expanding. And we're always going to have to keep pushing. There's nothing, I don't believe that necessarily there's an arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. We always have to keep pushing in every generation.
Yes, but we will keep pushing.
Of course.
So it's so interesting to hear, and I do this too. We have expanded who the we is in the country. We say that. You say that, and I say that. In reality, I know this as a parent. I have 3 kids, right? Mm-hmm. My 2 eldest kids were inseparable, young. And the 3rd one came around and she just pushed her way in. And then they were all 3 inseparable. But when I think about the we that is my 3 kids, right? The 2 of the oldest didn't make we bigger. The younger one pushed her way in, and the other ones can't imagine a world without her.
Yeah.
Right? And I think about the battles in America, the civil rights battle here. White America didn't say, "Oh, you know what? We were wrong. We really think we should have everybody be equal." It was 100 years or more, but 100 years from the end of slavery, of a conscious, hardworking effort to say, "Sorry, guys, we're here." And you know what? Afterwards, the rest of us are like, "Duh, of course you're here. Like, come on in." Right. So this
That's
fight
great.
to expand the we is always the guy who isn't here. And that's what makes American history unique, because we showed up like every other country that's ever broken from a colony, right? Broken from its master as a colony, and said, "We believe in freedom." But when we said it, it was patently untrue. And there were huge groups here who then had to say, "Okay, boys, if you mean it, you're going to have to find ways for us." And that is unique to us. And that's, I think, if we remember that, we're going to kick their ass.
I love when people, you hear people who are talking about student protesters now and how if only they could learn from the way that civil rights, Martin Luther King did it the right way. How come they can't do it like Martin Luther King? Martin Luther King was one of the most unpopular people at his time. He was pushing, and
so was Muhammad Ali, a hero.
Of course. So I guess maybe the one thing I bring it back to the book for a second, which is to say, there is an idea in that we talk a bunch about in the book, which is an idea from another scholar named Maria Stephan, who says that the lifeblood of civil resistance movements is something that she calls collective stubbornness. And one of the reasons that we wrote this book is that authoritarianism just looks different than it used to, right? It doesn't come into town on the back of a coup anymore. It happens through elections, the slow hollowing out of democratic institutions. So when democratic institutions are working less well, when the tools that we've generally used for these kinds of things, like elections, we still have elections, but they're skewed, or they're less free and less fair. We still have courts, but they're stacked. We still have a media, but it begins to be more tilted. You have to look to other tools. That's not to say that we shouldn't keep using those
we have to
tools.
improve
We have
them,
to keep using them. We have to improve them. We have to shore them up, and we have to insist on them, actually, and keep winning in them. But we also need this other set of skills. And it's the thing that you're talking about, which is collective stubbornness, which is gumming up the works, civil resistance, strike, boycott. These are things that the professional class that I come from, for example, is not used to. We are not schooled in these tactics. There's a respectability. Let's just do things the right way. And the truth is that once you hit, and we learn this from communities of color, from civil rights groups, from women,
from labor history,
from labor
women's.
history.
I mean, it just turns out to be all over American history, wherever you look. Right?
Exactly.
We just got the last few, like 50 years, 30 years, we outsourced that work to lawyers, and now we're like, yeah, no, it didn't work. We got
some of us outsourced it to lawyers, but other, domestic workers didn't, right? Like lots of people.
That's right.
Have continued having to, and all kinds of parts of the labor economy have had to continue doing this. I think that Muslim and Arab Americans after 9/11 are also a more recent example. And so there is, I think, it's a great point that we really do need to look to history, because we don't just have to. Somebody asked us this in San Francisco at an event we did the other day, like, how come you're spending all this time talking about the rest of the world? We have a history here to look to, and that's absolutely right. And I think
we can learn from the world. though. I mean, one of the lessons of our history is we can learn from the world.
That's true. That's true. Absolutely right.
All right. Just tell everybody where they can get this wonderful book.
So the book, on courage. That's okay. Yeah. The book On Courage, How to Be a Dissident in the Age of Fear. You can get it really anywhere that books are sold. You can get it, really anywhere that books are sold. You can call your local. It's at a lot of local bookstores, at Barnes & Noble, at Bookshop, and then all the other places that we don't say out loud. You can also get them there.
By the way, there's a lot of, as you heard in this conversation, talking about scholarship. It's not a scholarly book. It is a great read that is not for the scholars. It's for everyone who's in this fight.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
You bet. All right. Well, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.